Howdy again, Basstravaganza. It's time to start filming a new season. So guess where I'm at? Fabulous N2 Lake. 2 years ago I started out the season with a toast to Czech bar. Last year I used Pilsner Urquell, so this year go back to Czech bar. I'm back to start a new year of editing on the Basstravaganza. But for now, I'm going to leave the wily bass alone and going to keep my focus shifted onto wild fish habitat. So here I am back at my favorite spot, and let's have a toast to another year, hopefully, of steelhead at fabulous N2 Lake. Hopefully many more to come. I'll leave the development of more great bass lures to some future episodes. I want to complete my Tale of Two Rivers series, and I hope to start another one about a place I actually used to work doing in-stream restoration decades ago called Kudawas Creek. But this episode's going to be another retrospective and overview. In the first 3 episodes, you got to see Humpty's rather odd take on the history of fishing. Now you get to see his same unique perspective about the history of anadromous fish habitat in this part of the world. And this episode has already morphed into 2, just like the first episode grew into 3. So I hope this one doesn't morph into 3 as well. Before I start my discussion, I want to refer to a couple statements from a book I read recently. It was written by a retired BC government employee. I think that these words are an expression of an ideology that has ruled over BC for the past 20 years, and maybe more, you could say. It's the prevailing attitude by the province and the federal government with regard to the forest industry and wild fish and the streams they live in. You might say it's kind of a mantra they keep repeating to ward off evil spirits. First, let me briefly condense this book into a few sentences. The author was hired by the province as a steelhead biologist when there was still good steelhead fishing near his home in the Fraser Valley. But the good fishing there quickly went downhill, and he moved to Nanaimo, where there was great steelhead fishing in the local rivers. But the good steelhead fishing there quickly went downhill too, so he moved to northern Vancouver Island, where there was great steelhead fishing in the local rivers. But the good fishing quickly went downhill there too, so he moved to northern BC, where there was great steelhead fishing in the local rivers. But the steelhead declined there too, and the best rivers were privatized into the ownership of a few guides. And the upshot is that steelhead fishing used to be great in BC, but now it's basically toast for most people. And that's a pretty accurate overview of the situation, in my opinion. It's a few sentences near the end of the book that I want to mention here. So here I am back at my favorite spot, and let's have a toast to another year, hopefully, of steelhead at fabulous N2 Lake. Hopefully many more to come. The supply side of the wild steelhead equation is independent of influence until whatever adults materialize in a given year are in or near their river of origin. Habitat compromises have been obvious, but fixing broken streams is not an option. These statements are an indication of the mindset that has ruled here since European immigrants first began harvesting salmon here in the 1800s. Humans look after the harvesting, God looks after the fish habitat. Effingham Inlet, apparently, from what I heard, they had 15 inches of rain in 7 hours. And that's a lot. To me, it seems obvious that you can grow more wild fish by improving wild fish habitat, and fixing broken streams is an option. And the supply side is not independent of influence until the adults materialize. If you improve damaged fish habitat, you'll grow more juvenile fish, which will translate into more adults. Corn farmers use fertilizer and pesticides to get greater yields. The salmon feedlots here now work hard to maintain optimum conditions. They generate enormous harvests and enormous profits. Why wouldn't the same idea work with wild fish? You can see my homemade spinner with a teeny little hook on it and a big flashy blade. Then I attended a talk by a scientist from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and I learned about a new way to analyze the situation. According to his hypothesis, as I understand it, global warming has caused the plankton around Vancouver Island to bloom earlier than it did in the past, so the juvenile salmon don't have as much to eat nowadays when they migrate out of the rivers into the ocean. I think he said that the Strait of Georgia could only produce 10% as many salmon now as it did in the recent past. So adding more juveniles is basically irrelevant because the ecosystem has already reached its carrying capacity at only a fraction of the previous level, and it simply doesn't produce any more food to grow any more fish. There was a major effort by the province in the 1990s to assess stream habitat and begin restoration work. But this program was snuffed out immediately after the provincial regime change in 2001. A toast! Better pay attention to business here. This is a pretty good fish. Since then, stream habitat assessment and restoration has been all but eliminated in BC, not only from government funding, but also from discussion in politics and the media. Well, he doesn't want to come out of his honey hole. Come on, big boy. I disagree. I don't think it's the rivers and streams that are dead. I think it's the philosophy of watershed management that is dead here in BC and silhouetted against the horizon like the skeleton branches of an ancient cedar snag. And while I admire the boldness of any hypothesis that claims there is little or no linkage between the decline in BC wild fish and the decline in stream habitat here, it's still a hypothesis to me, not a proven fact. The ongoing trashing of BC's stream fish habitat is a fact. Watershed restoration isn't impossible, it's just impossible here in BC, under the current status quo. Of course you can influence the supply side of the steelhead equation. You just have to decide if it's worth the time and money and effort to do it. A more precise and grammatically correct way to make a statement like that would be to say, fixing broken streams is not an option in BC because political and corporate policy does not allow it to happen. Czechvar beer and wild steelhead. I was cold and all of a sudden I'm not cold anymore. Other people do it in other places. And I think there's a tremendous amount of productive work that could be done here, but is never tried here or anywhere else. And while I'm quoting, let me include a quote from a different book. It was about a guy who was obsessed with clipping branches off the most gigantic trees in the world and cloning them to use as a future gene bank. An interesting concept, but not the reason I bring it up here. This tree cloner guy said he liked to guide his own life by a number of short proverbs or aphorisms that he learned from his father. I thought they were cool too, so I wrote some of them down, and I think one of them is very appropriate here. If you think you can't, you're right. I think that pretty well sums up government and corporate philosophy regarding watershed restoration here in BC. A corollary to that statement might be, if you think you can, you're unemployed. And while I'm at it, let me add a quote from another one of my favorite books, long forgotten now, called Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon. In the book, there are a number of proverbs, proverbs for paranoids. And this is proverb for paranoid number 3. If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. And I think that applies here. If you make the assumption in the worlds of science and politics and the mass media that freshwater habitat is a minor or negligible part of the reason for the decline in salmon here on Van Isle, you don't have to pay attention to it.
Right. Oh, he spilled my beer. Come on, guy.
Cheers to fabulous N2 Lake, and to wild steelhead, and to Czech bar beer. You don't have to waste time assessing changes in stream habitat quality, and you surely don't have to waste public money improving it. Why bother improving stream habitat when the ocean around this huge island has suddenly turned for the worse, and it can't even support the pitiful few remaining juveniles our streams produce now? Meanwhile, we continue to force changes in our watersheds that will take hundreds or even thousands of years for Mother Nature to repair. Even if humans vanished from the scene tomorrow, why not give Mother Nature a hand? She has a lot of work to do already, and she could use some help. As a province, we're spending $12 billion on a dam that kills wild fish, and another $4 billion to build a few kilometers of subway in Vancouver. But we don't have a penny to spare to repair even a tiny fraction of the habitat damage we've done to most Van Isle rivers. But watershed restoration isn't something you can do alone. You need to work with other people and with government approval, federal, provincial, and Aboriginal, and corporate approval too in this part of the world. So before we discuss restoration, I want to discuss the evolution of the situation we're in here on Van Isle. I'm not going to start at the beginning, other than to mention the obvious, that the Aboriginal human populations here on Van Isle were managing an ecosystem that was not very productive in terms of grain crops or land mammals, but it was super productive in terms of big trees and big fish. Every major center of population was located near the most important thing in the world to those people, a stream with superb salmon habitat. I'm going to fast forward past that part and start with the history of Canada. Now, most people think of Canada as a country, but it didn't start out that way, especially here in BC. The entity that we now call Canada began as a private company. The British were a global empire by the 18th century, and they had colonized the middle of North America, but the big money in the empire in those days was in sugar. Sugar had been a delicacy in Europe until they started growing sugarcane in huge plantations in the Caribbean with slave labor. Suddenly the masses of Europe and the upper classes in North and South America became sugar addicts. The more sugarcane you grew, the more the sugar market expanded and the more money you made. The first of what might be called world wars were fought for the control of sugar islands. And when the smoke cleared, the British had maintained control over most of their prized sugar plantations in the Caribbean, but they lost control of their colonies further north. It wasn't so much that the U.S. won their war of independence, it was that Britain didn't want to waste the money and effort defending what was basically a losing proposition compared to their colonies in India and the Caribbean. Meanwhile, after the treaties were signed off, Britain had suddenly booted the French military out and gained control over the top part of North America, but it was miserably cold there compared to their other colonies. And the Europeans who still lived there all spoke the wrong language and worshipped at the wrong church. So, what to do with this northern subcontinent? How could you make a buck off the Great White North? Well, the first thing that came to mind was stupid hats. Now, if you've ever read anything by the old economist Thorstein Veblen, you're familiar with his theory of the leisure class and how the top 1% have got the problem of food, shelter, and clothing solved. So they turn to engaging each other in the game of conspicuous consumption. The more ritzy and useless an item is, the more value it has because it proves that you've got lots of money to burn. The rich women of the day sent hunting parties around the world to slaughter spectacular wild birds so they could pluck out a few feathers and stick them in their stupid hats. Some rare and beautiful birds were exterminated forever just for those stupid hats. But that was nothing compared to the guys. The stupid hat that had the greatest effect on human history and global ecology was the beaver hat. The hair you see when you look at a beaver is actually the outer layer, called the guard hairs. Under this is another layer of hair that's much softer and finer. I knew that they shipped a lot of beaver skins from Canada to Europe in the days of yore, and I'd heard the term beaver hat, but I'd never checked out the details. I'd always assumed that the hat was made from the whole skin of the beaver somehow. Not so. What they did was to ship the whole dry skin back to England and then strip all the hair off the skin. They had a way to separate the big guard hairs from the soft under hairs. In order to do this hair removal and sorting process, you had to soak the hide in a solution made with mercury. Now, mercury is poisonous to humans, and if you keep coming into contact with it, you die. But not right away. Before you die, it drives you crazy. Everybody knew this at the time, so only poor and unfortunate people worked in the beaver hat shops until they went crazy. And that's where the term Mad Hatter came from. It was the poor people processing Canadian beaver hides that went mad as a hatter. The weird guy in Alice in Wonderland was bonkers from processing Canadian beavers for rich people. And these stupid hats were totally useless for any purpose other than showing off to other rich people that, that you had the money to afford to buy one. So of course they soon started trending, and pretty soon every rich person had to have one. They were made from exotic species in a cold, remote land, and you had the added bonus of knowing that in the process of producing your status symbol, you drove poor, helpless people insane before condemning them to a miserable death. Now, if making stupid hats drove people crazy, what does that say about the people who wore them? My theory is that some of that mercury was still in the hats after they were sold, and it probably leaked out into the skulls and into the brains of the top 1% who bought them. And maybe that helps explain the mindset of the imperialists and global capitalists of that era. But again, I digress. I'll leave that subject for another day and get back to my talk about fish habitat. Anyway, the sugar junkies had inherited from France this cold northern wasteland where no respectable Englishman wanted to live, and the British government had to decide what to do with it. So after a few political favors were traded back and forth and maybe a little cash changed hands, the British gave this entire northern subcontinent away to a private company. People forget that the Canada we know today did not start out as a country. It started out as a private multinational corporation, the second big one in global history after the British East India Company. It was called Hudson's Bay Company, created by royal charter in 1670 and granted exclusive privileges to operate as a corporate monopoly in the business of harvesting the raw materials needed to make stupid hats as status symbols for rich people. So it's literally true that the initials HBC correctly refer to the company that was here before Canada. And it's also technically correct to state that the initials stand for the company that was here before Christ, because in many parts of the country, it was the company that came first and the missionaries that came later. The HBC dealt in skins of other animals like lynx and wolves and bears, but that was a sideline. The company was built around the beaver trade. Nothing else really mattered. The entire ecosystem, including the people in it, was channeled into stupid hats. Huge fortunes could have been made and later were made in timber and mining and fisheries and agriculture, but not while the HBC was in charge. They built forts and trading posts from Hudson's Bay to Labrador to the Great Lakes to the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, all for one purpose: stupid hats. Any person in their domain, Aboriginal or European, who was not contributing to the production of beaver hats was irrelevant, redundant, and a drain on corporate profits. Every Aboriginal culture across the North was crushed and converted to the production of stupid hats. Any Aboriginal person who didn't generate more stupid hats was considered worse than useless. Children were taken away from their parents and sent to concentration camp schools, where they were taught to help produce more beaver skins to help make more stupid hats. For a long time, the company's director in North America was George Simpson. He was a short little guy, and his idol was Napoleon. They called him the Little Napoleon, and he liked to pose with his hand in his pants like his hero. But Napoleon never had control of much more territory than a postage stamp compared to Simpson's half of a huge continent. At its peak, HBC controlled over 1/12 of the Earth's land surface. The company had the power of life and death over everyone and everything. Officials could and did execute native people and even their own employees at times if they caused trouble for the company. And Napoleon only lasted a few years before they put his ass in jail. But Simpson ruled as an omnipotent dictator for 40 years before he retired back to Montreal as a hero. Maybe Napoleon should have been called the Little Simpson. So Canada didn't start out as a country. It started out as a private company, and for hundreds of years the priorities were corporate, not national. And BC didn't start out as a province either. It started out as a part of the HBC domain, dedicated to the production of stupid hats for rich people. The company had forts on the mainland for 50 years after the start of the 19th century. And it was soon obvious that there were other tremendous resources to be exploited here, and it was just plain stupid to ignore them all except to gather skins for stupid hats. In those days, the U.S. was expanding and gobbling up everything in the path of its manifest destiny. The Louisiana Purchase, Texas, Oklahoma, California, finally Oregon and Washington. They kept pushing the Hudson's Bay Company corporate monopoly back. The HBC was finally kicked out of the North American mainland south of the 49th parallel, and the company built the new city of Victoria here on Van Isle as its new western headquarters. It was only when gold was discovered in the Fraser River that Britain was forced to act. There'd been gold in the rivers all along, but finding gold didn't help produce more stupid hats, so the company didn't bother looking for it. It wasn't in the company's charter to look for gold nuggets. They were only about stupid hats. But suddenly the Fraser River was swarmed by Yankee gold diggers, and if Britain didn't act fast and create a country of Canada, the Yanks were going to march in and take the Fraser watershed and add it to their national empire, just like they had done to so many other watersheds from the Mississippi to the Colorado to the Skagit. Maybe just as important or more important, in 1854, Prince Albert wore a silk top hat instead of a beaver hat to some formal affair. And that burst the bubble, and the beaver hat suddenly went out of fashion, along with the whole concept of managing an entire ecosystem of half of North America only for the production of stupid hats. So Canada became a country and BC became a province, and eventually the Hudson's Bay corporate monopoly was canceled, and HBC became just one of many companies operating here. But it's important to remember that Canada and BC in particular did not originate as a nation or a province. It began as a multinational corporation dedicated to the production of stupid hats for rich people and profits for absentee owners. I want to emphasize this because it's central to my discussion of stream ecology and restoration here on Vancouver Island. Today, these habitat issues are deeply connected to multinational corporate agendas, not just to political ones. Canada may be a country, but most of Vancouver Island is still better described as a colony. Humans live almost entirely in a narrow strip along the south and east coast. The economy of the other 90% of the land and the ocean nearby is dominated by foreign-owned multinational corporations that extract profits for foreign owners at the great expense of the environment and the local economy. Meanwhile, our wild salmon stocks dwindle towards extinction, and in some cases they have already reached it. Nowadays, salmon here are grown in feedlots owned by huge multinational companies controlled by foreign owners. The ancient forests are replaced by monoculture farms owned by foreign capital. Millions of identical trees, more like a crop of soybeans than a forest. The Hudson Bay Company was all about forcing the ecosystem and local communities to produce more stupid hats and quick hot cash for a handful of people on the other side of the world. Now the stupid hats have gone out of fashion, and it's all about cheap salmon, 2x4s, and wood pulp, and quick hot cash for a handful of people around the other side of the world. And most of Van Isle is still managed as a colony, not as a province that is part of a nation. But what does this colonial attitude have to do with fish? Hearing the news, you get the impression that maybe the Pacific Ocean is going to hell. All the news about salmon around here seems to be bad. It makes you wonder if the ocean is still a fit place for salmon to live anymore. That's why I was surprised, stunned actually, about what I learned when I happened to attend a talk by a famous salmon scientist from the Pacific Biological Station here in Nanaimo. Did you know that there may be more salmon in the Pacific Ocean right now than ever before in the history of planet Earth? Here are some graphs from the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission, the international organization of salmon harvesting nations. There's a lot of surprises here for me. First off, when I moved here in the 1970s, I assumed that Canada was the leading salmon fishing nation in the world. We had a huge coastline, loads of great rivers swarming with fish, and salmon was still the second biggest industry along the coast after logging. That's why I was surprised to learn that Canada has never been a major player in the Pacific salmon fishery. That role has always been filled by the US and Japan and increasingly Russia. You can see by the graph that Canada has never caught more than 10% of the fish, and usually much less. Also notice that Canada's share of the global harvest has been shrinking until the most recent years of data, when the Canadian catch barely even makes up 1% of the total world harvest. In 2018, the most recent year of data, Canada harvested 12 million, while Russia harvested an astounding 676 million salmon. The fish that I had associated with the commercial fishery here in BC were Chinook, followed by sockeye and then coho. The chums and pinks were hardly worth the bother of delivering to a packing plant. But a look at global catch shows that it's just the opposite. The world catch is mostly pinks, and always has been, followed by chums. In the wild, these are fish that spawn in the lower reaches of rivers, and the juveniles migrate out to sea almost immediately. Huge releases of pink salmon juveniles from hatcheries in Japan have pumped pink harvests there up to record levels. But it appears that the Russian and US fish are mainly wild. And if I might be allowed to point out, coming from watersheds that have not yet been clear cut. The total sockeye harvest for all of Canada in 2018 was only 2.5 million fish, if I see the data right. In Bristol Bay, Alaska alone, there have been returns of over 50 million wild sockeye in each of the past 5 years. So the salmon are not going extinct everywhere, like everything else seems to be nowadays. There may be more salmon in the ocean now than ever, but the global data makes it clear that the baby salmon hatched from struggling wild BC runs face stiff competition around the North Pacific. It's already swarming with young salmon. Ever since the 1980s, hatcheries around the North Pacific have been releasing around 5 billion baby salmon into the ocean every year. To me, that is more incentive to repair some of our damaged habitat and get a few more of our wild fish out there into the mix. All wild salmon are struggling in BC, but the different species are not declining at the same rate here on Van Isle. The stocks that are doing best are pink and chum salmon. They're gone from fresh water before summer when the logged off streams dry up. The species that migrate way upstream and spend a long time in streams as juveniles and that require high quality stream habitat 365 days a year have always been a minor part of the world catch. Chinook, coho, and steelhead have never amounted to more than a few percent of the global catch. It just seemed to me like they were a big deal because they were the backbone of the wild fishery here when I moved to BC. A fishery that supported factories and shipyards and trucking companies and steady jobs. These are fish that head inland, way up the rivers. Their juveniles spend months or even years in streams before they head out to sea, not just days like pink and chum fry. These are the species that are most vulnerable to the kind of stream habitat damage caused by reckless clear cutting, the kind that I documented in previous episodes of my Tale of Two Rivers. So if I may be allowed to repeat myself, global salmon stocks are not in decline. There may be more salmon swimming free in the ocean now than ever before, and millions more growing in feedlots. There may be more salmon in the ocean now than ever before in the history of this planet. But here on Van Isle, the wild salmon are going extinct in the streams that run through the clear cuts. Is it just me that notices the coincidence? I don't think so. I'm a fan of old-time black and white TV shows, and last year I was watching an episode of Hopalong Cassidy. Now Hoppy was smart and tough and fast with a six-shooter, and he usually never failed to bring the bad guys into justice if he hadn't already shot them dead. But in this episode, he was not riding out in the desert. He was way up in the high Sierras, and he came upon a bunch of loggers hacking down the old-growth forest. And he went on a classic rant about the environmental impacts of what they were doing. He was spitting hot fire, and he was even more furious because he knew there was nothing he could do about it. And the thing is, he was ranting about the same issues I will be ranting about here, and the same issues I have been ranting about for the past 50 years since I first moved to BC. But listening to Hopalong Cassidy spit the same rant. The loggers are trashing the rivers, and after they log the forest, the mountains cave in and the banks wash away and the streams dry up. That's what Hoppy was hopping mad about. And you could see it really bothered him, especially because he felt so hopeless. He could shoot bank robbers or put them in jail. He could solve that problem with hot lead, but there was nothing he could do about the loggers, and he knew it. But he still felt obliged to speak his mind. And so do I. So that pretty much traces the rise and fall of Hudson's Bay Company. In the next episode, I want to talk about the evolution of more modern forms of foreign capital and colonialism that came along after the HBC was stripped of its empire. and tried to connect some of the dots between the growth of huge, too big to fail logging corporations, degraded government oversight, degraded science or lack of any science at all, degraded wild fish habitat, and the crash of BC salmon stocks, and how it all leads to a sense of helplessness and apathy, and a bureaucracy based upon a dogma that fixing broken streams is not an option. So stay tuned for the next episode of the Basstravaganza.